Hello, I'm Kara Piccolo, and this is my assignment for Unit 2 on resonance and the source filter theory. So we've already discussed how sounds are created, and we know that sound waves are created by the compression and rarefaction of air particles. But how does the human vocal tract manipulate those sound waves to produce speech? Well, in order to answer that question, we need to know a little bit about resonance and the source filter theory. I've defined those terms here on this slide, but we'll go into them in a little more depth on the following slides. This is a definition of resonance that I found on Google Dictionary, and I really liked it. It says that resonance is the reinforcement or prolongation of sound by reflection from a surface or by the synchronous vibration of a neighboring object. So what does that mean exactly? We can break it down to mean that vibrations can be made larger or their amplitude can be increased by either the surfaces they hit within a container or by the vibration of a nearby object. So for that first example, we can think about the echo in a large auditorium. The sounds are hitting the hard surfaces and they're amplified, so that room is a resonator. We can also see this with singing wine glasses. So this is something I've never been able to master, but I've seen other people do it. You can rub your finger along the top of a wine glass, and then that sets that wine glass into a vibrating motion. And then those vibrations are going to hit the surface of glasses in close proximity to them and set them into motion. Just like the wine glasses and the auditorium in the previous example, the vocal tract is also a resonator. So the vocal tract is considered both a mechanical resonator and an acoustic resonator. It's considered mechanical because it has the ability to set itself into motion. And then it's acoustic because it's a series of air-filled containers that allows for frequency amplification, just like a guitar. It's also considered a quarter wave resonator, and the picture to the right shows an example of how it's a quarter wave resonator. It's open at one end, so you can see the nasal cavity and the nose, and the oral cavity and the mouth are the open end, and then down at the bottom, where we start at the lungs, is the closed end. It's called a quarter wave resonator because a quarter of the wave fits into the tract at any given time. And it's also has a unique shape that allows it to produce a wide variety of sounds. So we say that the vocal tract is broadly tuned. In addition, the vocal tract has an ability to change shape, so it is a variable resonator. So now that we understand resonance, we'll talk about the source filter theory. So basically, this just means that air is pushed up through the vocal tract by the systems in the thoracic cavity. And then the vocal cords are pushed apart by pressure and then come back together due to elasticity. This creates displacement of air particles and a buzzing sound, and that is considered the source. So we have our source right there at the glottis where our vocal cords are vibrating. The frequency of this waveform is called our fundamental frequency. Then from there, air travels up into the resonating cavities, which filter the sound. So we can see on the picture on the right, the filters are the nasal cavity, the oral cavity, and the pharyngeal cavity. And then we have down there the source as the vocal cords. Now that we know that the pharyngeal cavity, oral cavity, and nasal cavities are the resonating cavities within the vocal tract, we'll look a little closer at how they work. So these resonating cavities act as a filter. They amplify some sounds and they damp others. So as the sound travels through these different resonating cavities, the quality of the sound is going to change. Damping occurs due to the density of tissue. So since we're not robots, we're not made of metal, the sound is going to be dampened by the soft tissue in our vocal tract. You can think of this like how sound travels in a carpeted room versus a hardwood floor. That carpeting is soft and kind of absorbs some of the sound, just like our tissues do in our vocal tract. And then to the right, I have a diagram there to explain how the amplitude of wave changes in different cavities due to the size of the cavities. So you can see that the pharyngeal cavity is much larger and the oral and nasal cavities are smaller. The resonating cavities change in size and shape and are different for everyone. Since the pharyngeal cavity is the largest, sound is going to have greater amplitude because there's more space for the particles to move around. So if you look at the diagram and you think of those little stars as our air particles, you can see in the example on the top they have greater amplitude because they have more space to move around. The frequency at the pharyngeal cavity is going to be considered the first formant. So this is formant 1. Once the sound wave travels up through the pharyngeal cavity, we'll start to see a lot more variation in the sound depending on where that sound goes next. So let's look at the consonant M. The production starts in the glottis and moves up through the pharyngeal cavity just like every other speech sound. But M differs from vowels and most other consonants because it then moves into the nasal cavity. So when you produce the M sound, it doesn't really matter where your tongue is. You can move your tongue around, wiggle it around in there, and it doesn't change the sound because the sound's not coming through your mouth, it's coming through your nasal cavity. On the right, we have a diagram that shows the opening and closing of the velopharyngeal port. So when we make the M sound, the velopharyngeal port is open to allow access to the nasal cavity, and it closes off the oral cavity. The lips close to make the air exit through the nose as well. So the waveform changes again due to the size, shape, and density of the tissue in the nasal cavity. And this is the second formant. So F2 is generated there in the nasal cavity. The amplitude is going to be lower than it is for vowels with the M consonant because there's more damping from the tissue in the nasal cavity than in the oral cavity. And that's because the nasal membranes are very dense. Now that we know how the M consonant is formed, let's look at vowels. Now vowels get a little bit more complicated, so I'm going to use the vowel U as an example. The process begins the same way. Fundamental frequency is going to be generated at the glottis, and then the first formant is going to be generated at the pharyngeal cavity and have the greatest amplitude. However, the second formant is going to be generated now by the oral cavity. The velopharyngeal port is going to be closed to completely block off the nasal cavity, and then the sound is filtered by the density of the tissues and the size of the oral cavity. This is also where we see something called valving occur. So the positioning of the articulators are like valves on a flute. They're going to create kind of an obstacle course for the air particles. So if you look at the diagram on the right, that dark purple area is going to represent the oral cavity, and then the lighter purple blocks are going to represent the different valves. So we have the lips and teeth, the tongue, and the velopharyngeal port. You can see that with the U consonant, the lips are going to be slightly open, the tongue is going to be high in the oral cavity and retracted back, and then that velopharyngeal port is closing off the nasal cavity above. To summarize, we've learned that our vocal tract is capable of producing an enormous variety of speech sounds. We've also learned that the vocal tract is both a mechanical and acoustic resonator. It's a quarter wave resonator, and it has the ability to manipulate sounds based on the irregular shape and the ability to change shape. We also know that the glottis is the source, and the pharyngeal, oral, and nasal cavities are resonators that filter sound. And we know that this filter can dampen some sounds and amplify others. We also know that the movement of air particles through the vocal tract is different for the nasal consonants and vowels. So with nasal consonants, the second formant is generated in the nasal cavity, and then for the vowels, the second formant is generated in the oral cavity and is manipulated by the articulators, which act as valves.